Never seen a welterweight hit as hard as this kid. Nobody.
Hagler with two good jabs and a right hand that might have hurt Hagler. Tremendous pace in the first round. I expected this, Barry. Both guys are going in.
The main thing about these great fighters like Hearns is that people forget that although they've got a great name and they're legends, people forget what he was like.
He's just fighting on instinct, though, Gil. He's just hanging a big right hand. That's it, Jim. And he's going to roll forward. The fight's over.
Hill. She tries to come across with a right, but Hearns answers with a counter right hand.
It's hard to think of a more perfect boxer-puncher than the legendary Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Hearns was a masterclass in using beautiful boxing to set up tremendous power shots. He used his signature flicker jabs and chopping right crosses to climb his way through 5 championships in 5 different weight classes. These techniques were so unique, they were even referenced in the popular boxing anime Hajime no Ippo. Many credit Hearns' successes to his lengthy frame, but it's far more accurate to say that Hearns knew how to use his natural advantages to their fullest. You would be hard-pressed to find a better template for an aspiring tall, lengthy fighter than the Hitman. So today, let's look at all the incredible techniques and tactics that came out of Hearns' unique style, and examine exactly how and why they worked so well for the Hitman. Hearns began his career as a stylist, using footwork and timing to set up his lightning-fast jab. Much like his hero, Muhammad Ali, Hearns would use a cross step to circle to the inside, throwing out his jab elbow first. Yet another trait that Hearns borrowed from Ali was keeping his lead hand low. Keeping a low front hand is basically asking for a punch to the face, and leading with your elbow, as Hearns did, is normally nothing more than a great way to announce to your competitor that your punch is coming. But something truly amazing about Hearns is that he turned both principles on their head, as demonstrated by the sheer number of successfully connected jabs followed by power shots. In fact, his low lead hand often enticed opponents to headhunt, drawing out punches that Hearns could then slip and counter. One benefit of keeping his lead hand low was that it allowed Hearns to punch upwards, raising his hand through the small space in his opponent's guard. And this created a number of great opportunities to confuse his opponents, since the initiation of the movement for his jab was the exact same as the start of Hearns' body jabs and lead hooks. So Hearns' opponents couldn't be sure whether to expect a jab, a hook, or a body shot, as Hearns could change his strike mid-motion between all 3. Or Hearns could simply feint to trick his opponents into expecting one punch, only to immediately land with another. And there were a few preparatory motions that Hearns was fond of that really helped him sell these deceptions. Hearns constantly pumped his lead hand, building anticipation for the punch in order to dull his opponent's reflexes for when the real punch came. At times, he would even sway his lead hand back and forth like a scythe before blending that motion into a punch. Hearns was also a big fan of the double jab or even triple jab. He used the first jab to gauge an opponent's reaction, and the second or third jab then capitalized on the openings that reaction had created. In fact, Hearns' low guard and punch variety could allow him to dominate fights with just a few punches from his lead hand alone. But as Hearns developed over time into a legendary knockout artist, his flicker jab evolved into a powerful tool to set up his insane right cross. When opponents got their head snapped back by one of Hearns' powerful jabs, they could expect Hearns' chopping right to follow shortly after. Competitors who attempted to parry or catch Hearns' rising jabs realized too late that they had just created an opening for one of the greatest rear hands in boxing history. Part of the reason Hearns was able to land his power right so effectively was that he had already gauged his opponent's distance with his jabs, using his arm as a yardstick to determine range and position. This tactic is especially helpful for taller fighters with a longer reach, as it can be difficult to keep track of the shorter fighter's head movement with sight alone. Aside from measuring distance, Hearns would also leave his arm extended to frame off of his opponents. In addition to keeping an opponent safely at length, framing also allowed Hearns to manipulate his opponent's head or shoulders, redirecting their momentum at worst, and throwing them completely off balance at best. Transitioning between frames and collar ties, Hearns would force his opponents to make the terrible choice between stumbling around blindly or losing their balance completely. This same tactic was used very effectively by George Foreman when he took the championship from Joe Frazier. Another major advantage was that Hearns could easily use his footwork to reposition himself while maintaining that constant arm's length shield between himself and his opponent. And the same way that Muay Thai practitioners use this long guard to establish angles for their roundhouse kicks, Hearns could also steer his opponents while transitioning himself to an advantageous angle to land his power shots. This strategy afforded Hearns even more control of his opponent's movements, draining away their energy as he piled up points. While the tactics described so far could have been developed by Hearns intuitively through years of hard work and experience, the way that he completely dismantled an opponent's defenses through carefully crafted combinations shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that Hearns possessed a terrific ring IQ. When people think of fighters who excelled at destroying their opponent's guard, they most likely think of shorter, stockier boxers like Mike Tyson, or kickboxers like Gokhan Saki, a fighter who uses footwork and head movement to get in close before tearing apart their opponent's guard with angling hooks and uppercuts. And this does work really well for shorter fighters with shorter arms. But for a lengthier, long-range fighter like Hearns, this approach had to be drastically modified. Whereas Tyson might have thrown a body hook directly into a head hook, Hearns was too far away to do this without telegraphing his intentions, especially if he was hoping to double up with his rear hand. So, Hearns simply, but brilliantly, put a jab in between all of his rear hand power shots. By inserting flicker jabs into his guard-destroying combinations, Hearns occupied the opponent's time with a throwaway punch while still alternating between high and low power punches. So while Tyson could throw right body hook, right head hook from close range, Hearns could throw jab right body hook to jab right head hook from long range. The result was the same, an opponent clearing their own guard out of the way in anticipation of a low punch that instead went high. Because of Hearns' dense punch vocabulary, he could at times get away with simply blasting out a right. It's ironic that sometimes complex, nuanced setups can allow a fighter to get away with blazingly blatant attacks. And it's not like opponents weren't looking for it, as most of Hearns' fights ended via his terrifying chopping right. Sometimes called a roundhouse right or vertical hook, Hearns' chopping right was an odd mix of more traditional punches. It came from underneath and to the side, then snapped over, with Hearns' elbow often turning towards the ceiling at the end of the movement. While at first glance it seems like a punch that could be easily defended, it actually put Hearns' opponents in a pretty tough spot. Not only was it difficult to notice it coming from underneath and around their guard, but the atypical path of Hearns' right allowed him to navigate through the cracks in his opponent's defenses. He could also cross over their jab and around their lead shoulder. or follow the path of their head movement if they tried to duck away. In this scenario, Hearns would often miss with his glove, but still land with the palm of his hand or even his forearm, and the effect was still a nightmare for his competitors. For those looking to add Hearns' chopping right to their own toolkit, pay attention in particular to how Hearns would use his footwork to complement his cross. Hearns would step forward into his cross. This generated more momentum and helped to close the distance for follow-up shots. In fact, stepping into a more neutral stance put Hearns in a prime position to follow up with a lead hook. And Hearns threw this shot very well to the head or the body. But believe it or not, Hearns' chopping right wasn't always enough on its own to get the job done. And that is why one of the things that really stands out when looking at Hearns' career was the sheer number of TKOs that he amassed alongside his one-punch KOs. Hearns knew that, even as a fighter who boxed best at a distance, there would be times where he would need to get in close and swarm his competitor. This would usually present some problems for a taller fighter, as they could easily get tied up or have their lengthier arms stifled at close range. But Hearns had a number of strategies to work around this problem. Since Hearns couldn't take advantage of tight, controlled punches like Mike Tyson or Roberto Duran, he would instead loop and arc his punches when at close range. This not only allowed him to get full extension, but also let him take advantage of the limited space to still generate power. This did cut down on his speed a bit, as his punches needed to travel wider arcs to cover the same distance. But Hearns could create more space to punch by shuffling laterally, giving himself room to extend his arms. This tactic worked very well against opponents who tried to aggressively move forward in an attempt to overwhelm Hearns at close range or enter into the clinch. Hearns could then move back and sideways, stepping out of the line of danger while at the same time countering with his own punches. In fact, Hearns could essentially invite opponents to walk directly into one of his hard shots. There are few fighters with as much to teach the next generation as Thomas the Hitman. After avenging his one and only loss against Roberto Duran, Leonard set his eyes on a new competitor. A fighter who could both box with skill and nuance, and also hit like a freight train. A man with a 4-inch reach advantage and an undefeated record at 32 wins with 30 by knockout. That man was the legendary Thomas the Hitman Hearns. But as imposing as Hearns was, Leonard had something to prove. Many saw Ray as still untested, seeing his fight with Duran not so much as a victory for Leonard, as a disgrace for Duran. Leonard saw an opportunity to prove himself, once and for all. And Hearns saw an opportunity for an easy win over a big name. A knockout could propel him into the public eye and cement him as one of the most iconic boxers of the era, and he expected to make easy work of Sugar Ray. Hearns would say during a presser, "My right hand could make this the easiest fight I've ever had." Leonard responded saying, "Hearns makes mistakes. He tries to knock everybody out with one punch. I use my mind. Maybe Tommy would too, if he had one." While Leonard tried to portray Hearns as an unrefined power puncher, and Hearns tried to portray Leonard as timid and weak, the truth was that the two men had far more similar styles than people realized. Both had been heavily influenced by Muhammad Ali. Leonard relied more on his footwork, mixing broken rhythm and foot feints into his setups, and layering stutter steps and jabs on top of each other until his competitor was left bewildered and confused. Hearns had mastered many of these same tactics, but he relied far more heavily on his signature flicking jab. Like Muhammad Ali, Hearns threw his jab like a whip, and it was highly versatile. Hearns could throw it from all different angles, leave it out to stiff arm and steer his competitor, or pull them into a shot. But most importantly, the jab set up Hearns' signature right, a punch that chopped down like an axe, somewhere between a hook, a cross, and an overhand. What this all meant was that Leonard was in a frightening situation. He was facing a man who had a similar style to himself, but with a noticeable size, reach, power, and height advantage. The night came, and both men entered the ring. Hearns donned a robe with the words, "Winner takes all," blazoned on the back. Leonard's robe simply read, "Deliverance." Upping the stakes even more was the fact that Muhammad Ali, hero and inspiration to both, had front row seats to the fight. The two men went into their corners, and then the showdown began. The first few rounds, the fighters mostly kept their distance and tested each other's reflexes, but there were hints and indications of what a dramatic and action-filled back-and-forth fight the bout would shortly become. Hearns' strategy was no mystery. He hoped to push forward and land his iconic 1-2, ending the night early. But Leonard had a choice. As the great Marvin Hagler put it, to neutralize Hearns' reach advantage, Leonard is going to have to stay either inside of it or outside of it. Leonard chose the first option, hoping that he could outbox Hearns and rely on his reflexes and footwork to negate Hearns' flicking left hand. To pull this off, Leonard took the advice of his coach and moved to the outside every time Hearns got in position to throw his right. Hearns marched forward at a steady pace, throwing double jabs to set up his right, while Leonard employed his signature footwork to stay out of harm's way. Each found some initial success. Hearns clipped Leonard with the right 2 minutes into the round, his speed and superior reach negating Leonard's crafty angles. A minute later, Ray displayed his own boxing prowess. He bounced back and forth in a lateral stance, foot feinting outside. Hearns stepped outside in an attempt to cut off the ring, but the small step had opened him up, and Leonard fluidly moved inside the jab. But this jab itself was yet another feint, used to draw Hearns' own jab. Leonard was already pulling back out of harm's way, and now he stepped inside to land with his left before pivoting out to the center of the ring to exit. Fighting Sugar Ray Leonard could be confusing, to say the least. But the most entertaining punch of the first round landed well after the bell. Ray tried to push Tommy aside and said, "Got you, sucker." Hearns, not in a playful mood, punched Leonard in the face. Leonard smiled and once again pretended to wobble. In round 2, each fighter felt comfortable enough to open fire with some riskier shots, if only sparingly. Midway through the round, Hearns connected with a sharp right that whipped Leonard's head back, tracking Leonard's head movement off of a lead hook. And Ray landed with a lead hook off of Hearns' jab near the end of the round. Both fighters had now proven they could land with power shots, but the main takeaway was not that each could find the other with more impactful punches. It was the fact that Hearns had proven already, in the second, without a shadow of a doubt, that he could outbox Leonard. In fact, he was clearly starting to dominate the outside game. Leonard's entire plan had been to outbox Hearns, tearing into his body to sap his energy, and countering him when he inevitably grew frustrated and haphazardly rushed in. But it was Leonard who was having trouble finding openings, and Hearns was punishing him for it, using effective head movement to evade Leonard's attacks, and utilizing his superior range to catch Leonard as he tried to move back into a safe distance. In regards to body punches, it was once again Hearns who was landing the more consistent, solid shots. By the end of the second, it had become apparent to Leonard's coach, the great Angelo Dundee, that Ray could not win the fight by boxing at long range. "You've got to get closer to him," Angelo pleaded in the corner. "You've got to start fighting." But to quote Leonard, that was easy for Angelo to say. Trying to get close to Tommy Hearns carried its own risks. I was fighting the Hitman, and he wasn't called the Hitman for nothing. But I had no choice. The first few days after losing to Duran were perhaps the worst days of my life, and I'd die before I went through that again. And so, the third round started off with a bang. Hearns got aggressive, eager to pay Leonard back. Leonard stayed in the pocket, skillfully avoiding Hearns' punches, but throwing few of his own. And then, finally, things got serious. It began when Leonard shuffled in deep to throw a hard overhand to Hearns' jaw. Hearns stifled the tremendous punch and rode it back. He missed with a tight rear hook, framed off Leonard's shoulders, and shuffled out to exit. But Ray turn shifted, throwing his entire body into a rear hook. Hearns ducked under and came up smiling. But Leonard was relentless, no doubt trying to wipe the grin off of Hearns' face. Hearns stifled his right, and Leonard slipped his in return. He nearly caught Hearns with a tight left hook, but Hearns managed to block it just in the nick of time. The punch grazed Hearns without inflicting any damage, but Leonard was already following up with another fight-ending right. Hearns pulled back, avoiding the punch by a fraction of an inch. Rarely had two talented fighters seem so equally matched, each avoiding the other's knockout blows by the skin of their teeth. And now it was Hearns' turn to go on the offensive. The two continued to fight at mid-range, neither able to land anything significant. But then, seconds away from the bell, Hearns got his distance and connected with Leonard's forehead, following up with a devastating body shot. Hearns was throwing too much heat for Leonard, and he was forced to back up against the ropes. He narrowly avoided a chopping right, but took another deep blow to the gut. The round ended with Hearns pulling what would have been another body shot. The man that Leonard had suggested be lobotomized just to see if there would be any difference was now outsmarting him as both a boxer and a puncher. It became apparent that Hearns had left Leonard a parting gift. A large welt had formed under his left eye. The fourth round produced much of the same. Leonard was outpointed at long range, and although he managed to land some beautiful combinations, he was being effectively countered the majority of the time. Hearns' excellent footwork, solid head-body combinations, and long reach helped him to catch Leonard as he tried to exit exchanges. Once again, Hearns punctuated the match with thumping shots to the body, and once again, the two exchanged after the bell. Leonard returned to the corner with a grin, but he had clearly lost the round. Understandably, Leonard went back to jabbing at range in round 5. He tried to showboat by winding up his rear hand as he had against Duran, hoping that perhaps Hearns would become furious and frustrated as Duran had. But Hearns began winding his rear hand as well, snapping Leonard's head back and smartly staying behind his whipping, sharp jabs. Leonard was subdued on the outside by Hearns' flicker jab, and the inside by body blows and the threat of Hearns chopping right. To put it simply, Leonard was losing, but he never stopped watching Hearns like a hawk, on the lookout for any slight misstep or opening. That opening came in the 6th. The round began with Leonard stepping into a stinging lead hook, the sound of the impact drawing gasps from the crowd. Leonard once again backed off and continued to dance. One announcer quipped that Leonard may be hoping one punch would turn it his way. The other responded that it was possible, but not probable. But then... the two had performed this exact same exchange repeatedly since the 3rd, like a familiar opening to a chess game. But this time, rather than duck out, Hearns tried to connect with an uppercut. And Ray snuck in a tremendous blow to Hearns' chin, loaded from below his hip and slanted to angle through the hitman's guard. Hearns staggered and stumbled, his legs turned to rubber. Leonard went in for the kill, pummeling Hearns with lefts and rights from all angles. But Hearns was still dangerous and connected with a right to the head, and more body blows. Leonard was undeterred and backed Hearns off with a whipping hook. Now it was Leonard's turn to go to the body, lowering Hearns' guard before targeting his head. But Hearns now moved as he swung, cutting angles and using head movement to survive Ray's onslaught. Although he still took some incredible punishment, he managed to survive the round. The bell rang. Leonard turned to Hearns and taunted, "You all right?" Hearns walked away in a daze. But despite his taunting, Leonard walked away exhausted himself, having expelled a tremendous amount of energy trying to put Hearns away. "Unfortunately, I got excited," Leonard would later admit. "If I had slowed down and shortened my punches, I might have put him away there." As for Hearns, he knew that if he just had a bit longer to recover, he could come back and win the fight. Conventional wisdom said that Hearns would need to keep his distance and play it safe. So in the next round, Hearns pressed forward, staying toe-to-toe with Leonard, looking to slug it out. Perhaps he was looking to intimidate Leonard and make him question how badly he'd really been hurt. But Leonard was not fooled, and the hitman's dulled reflexes and lack of power signaled just what a bad state Tommy was still in. Throughout the entirety of the fight, Ray had had difficulty getting in range. But now, Hearns closed the distance for him. At that moment, it was the greatest gift that anyone could have given Leonard. Leonard stayed close with his hands held high, now able to take the impact of Hearns' punches on his guard before returning fire. He beat on Hearns like a punching bag, wrecking his body and throwing hook-uppercut combinations through the cracks in his guard. Hearns pushed him away to get some distance, and Angelo shouted, "Stay inside, Ray!" Leonard obliged. Hearns was forced back, and Leonard unloaded with savage lefts and rights, throwing a tremendous punch with each step forward. But if Hearns was bothered, he didn't show it. Mid-round I wasn't scared, Hearns would later recount. I was just trying to regain my composure. I knew once the bell rang, all I needed was a few more minutes to get myself together. As the round progressed, Leonard's arms became weary, his punches slower and less consistent. But he kept pushing, certain he could end the fight. But somehow, Hearns held on, picking his moments to throw dangerous hooks and crosses, doing anything he could to keep Leonard at bay. I was ready to stop the fight, the referee would later recall, and if Ray had landed one more solid punch, I would have. But Tommy was avoiding them then. Barely. It was clear to everyone that if Hearns were going to win the fight, he needed to change his strategy. His coach, the legendary Emmanuel Stewart, came to his rescue. "You've got to be the boxer now," insisted Stewart. "Get back on the bicycle. Stick and move." And in the 8th, it was not Ray, but Hearns that channeled the great Muhammad Ali. Hearns seemed to come out a different fighter, showing off the dynamic footwork and jab game that had won him so many bouts in his amateur career. Hearns had not always been a knockout artist. It wasn't until he had switched trainers and put a good deal of muscle onto his lengthy frame that he had turned into the hitman so feared in his division. Hearns had made his name on his boxing skills, and now, for the first time in years, he put them to full use. Likewise, Leonard took Hearns' place and pressed forward, attempting to land power shots and cut off the ring. Halfway through the scheduled rounds, the two had switched strategies entirely. Hearns had difficulty putting steam into his power shots while moving backwards, but his jab still hit like a hammer, snapping Leonard's head back and exacerbating the swelling in his left eye. Leonard would later compare Hearns' jab to a 12-gauge shotgun that never stopped firing. This dynamic continued for the next 3 rounds. Despite Ray's extensive training in camp to prepare for Hearns' jab, the punches were hitting clean. What's more, the consistent body punches from Hearns and the tremendous effort he'd put into the earlier rounds had Leonard gassed. I was exhausted. I was gasping for breath. His jab seemed like a sledgehammer. The 11th began, and things went from bad to worse for Leonard. Hearns connected with his signature punch. Outwardly, Leonard remained calm, but he backed up for the first time since getting Tommy in trouble, and kept backing up as Hearns pressed forward. Now the fight had done a complete 360, and Hearns pursued once again, landing accurate body shots that would have crumpled many of his former competitors. Near the end of a dominant round, Hearns set up a brilliant trap. He halted his pursuit and reversed direction, dancing back and stepping into a lateral stance as if he were about to circle away. Instead, he fired a snappy right hand, stepped in with the left, moved back again into a squared up position, rebounded forward with another right, and only then shuffled out. This was one of Ali's more complex maneuvers, and Hearns had just demonstrated he could pull it off in front of his idol. But he had used this trick on Sugar Ray Leonard, and because he was Sugar Ray Leonard, he managed to pay back the favor with a shifting overhand from southpaw. Despite that, Ray had taken 3 hard punches for every one that he landed. In the 12th, the fight would enter a new dynamic, one unfamiliar to each fighter so far. Both men had taken turns being the aggressor and the defender, the boxer and the puncher. But now the two stood right in front of each other at arm's length, taking turns attacking and countering. Both men had some success, blending aggressive offense with responsible defense. But still, Ray was falling behind, his work rate far lower than Hearns. Behind on points, Leonard needed a knockout to win, and he simply wasn't doing enough to make that happen. Ray's mind told him to throw more punches, but his body wasn't listening. For that matter, Hearns wasn't putting pressure on Leonard as he might have been, mostly keeping behind his jab. He would explain years later, Why didn't I try to land more right hands? Basically, because I don't throw a punch if I know it's not going to land. But the truth was, Hearns had nothing left to prove in this fight. It was Leonard who was in dire straits. And to make matters worse, his eye was now near completely shut. Leonard was on the verge of losing everything he'd worked for. In his mind, a loss would mean all those who thought of him as a made-for-TV fighter would be proven right. In the corner, Dundee gave Leonard some tough love and uttered the now famous words, "You're blowing it, son. You're blowing it. You gotta fire. You're not firing. You got 9 minutes." It was exactly what Leonard needed to hear. The words pulled him out of his dark thoughts of humiliation and defeat. He put away his fears and set his mind on the task at hand. The new plan was to attack Hearns with everything he had, putting himself directly in the line of fire. In Leonard's own words, "I decided to attack Tommy with everything I had, no matter how close I might get to his right hand. If I was going down, I was going down as a warrior." Leonard had been ducking into overhands to avoid getting countered by Hearns' tremendous right throughout the fight. But now, Leonard stood right in front of Hearns, lined up his shot, and threw a thudding 1-2. Hearns stumbled. Leonard went into action, unloading 25 punches in a matter of seconds. The last punch sent Hearns stumbling back to the ropes. While the lightest of punches could have sent Hearns through the ropes, it was a push that did it, and so the fall was counted as a knockdown. But it didn't make much difference. Hearns got to his feet, and Leonard continued his relentless barrage. Hearns tried to clinch, but he had rarely ever been in a situation where it was necessary for him to slow down the action before. Hearns was attempting double collar ties, leaving both of Ray's arms free. Hearns managed to connect with a hard right, but Leonard would not be deterred. In his mind, one of them was going down. He continued his frenzied pursuit, walking through punches, shrugging off clinches, and landing hard shot after hard shot. Leonard would recount years later, "I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. The exhilaration as each shot hit his target, the most wonderful feeling in the world. I fed off the roar of the fans and the sight of my opponent in trouble, ready to be destroyed. And to think there were people who would question if I could be ferocious enough when it was necessary. How wrong they were. I loved to hit other men. I loved to see them crumble." Hearns collapsed against the ropes with seconds left in the round, and this time, the ref called a knockdown. But Hearns was saved by the bell. With a minute to recover, Hearns had one last chance to take the fight. Going into the 14th, Hearns was still ahead on rounds. If he could survive for 6 more minutes, the fight and the title were still his. He tried to dance, going back to the strategy that had saved him and turned the tide of the fight rounds before. Hearns showed incredible heart, throwing combinations before dancing away. But Leonard had learned his lesson. He had missed his chance to win in the 6th by overreacting, and again in the remaining rounds by trying to pick the perfect shot. This time, he didn't hesitate to fire, but neither was he trigger happy. And Hearns had never gone this many rounds before. Still shook and deeply exhausted, he made for an easy target. Even a jab sent him flying across the ring. A minute in, a looping right sent Hearns crashing against the ropes. Leonard raised his arms in victory, but Hearns refused to go down. He took punch after punch as Leonard signaled for the ref to stop it in between flurries. After a minute of enduring Leonard's hardest punches, the ref mercifully called a stop to the fight. Hearns had suffered the first defeat of his career, but he had proved himself a true champion, a skillful boxer, and a resilient fighter with a lot of heart. Even though he was defeated, this fight was one of the first steps to cementing his enduring legacy as an iconic boxer. In victory, Sugar Ray had just proven his detractors wrong, showing the world beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was one of the greatest fighters of all time. The two champions would meet again, but before they did, Hearns would go on to have 2 legendary battles, one against Leonard's old rival, the Hands of Stone, Roberto Duran, and the other against Marvelous Marvin Hagler in what was considered one of the most action-packed, explosive fights of all time. Hagler vs. Hearns is widely regarded as one of the greatest fights in boxing history, and perhaps the greatest short fight in all of combat sports. In an era of great competitors, two of the greatest faced off and gave everything they had for 3 rounds, throwing a combined total of 338 punches, with each fighter landing over half of them. At first billed as the fight, this match would come to be known as the War. Both Hagler and Hearns were elite champions who had developed their own unique styles and strategies. Hagler was a switch hitter, comfortable fighting with either foot forward. He used this to great effect to cut off the ring or catch his opponents when they thought themselves safe. One of the greatest benefits of this is that Hagler didn't need to pivot to remain in a defensive guard like most fighters. He instead weaved as he turned to face his opponent with his opposite foot forward. This tactic earned him a number of knockouts throughout his career. As well as being comfortable in any position, Hagler was also formidable at any range. At long range, Hagler would shuffle into his lead. While gazelle punches are normally done with hooks or uppercuts, this was effectively a lead straight or almost like a gazelle jab. It covered massive distance and packed a lot of power. At close range, Hagler would break his opponent's defenses down with a steady downpour of relentless punches. And lastly, Hagler's ability to take a punch was legendary. Hagler never seemed to lose steam. He had rarely ever been wobbled, let alone knocked down. And it was widely expected that if he were to win against Hearns, it would be in the later rounds after steadily wearing him down. Hearns was a long-range in-and-out fighter with a fast, flicking jab and a terrifying right hand. Hearns' power was incredible. Whereas Hagler had gone the distance with the hands of stone, Roberto Duran, Hearns had taken him out almost effortlessly, sending him crashing to the canvas. Hearns maintained his distance through his incredibly versatile and crafty lead hand, using a combination of lightning-fast jabs, stiff arming, and head control to stay safe and set up his chopping right. Conventional wisdom said that if Hearns were to win, it would be an early victory, having cracked Hagler's granite chin. But at the opening bell, it was Hagler who shocked everyone by charging right at Hearns. Hagler was usually a refined fighter, who took his time wearing his opponents down. But now he threw every punch with full force. This left him dangerously open, but it had the desired effect. Hagler wanted to establish immediately that he was not to be taken lightly. In fact, he was someone to be feared. Hearns tried to dance away, but Hagler cut off the ring, using body shots to slow Hearns' movement and set up punches to the head. And so it was clear within the first 20 seconds that whichever way this fight ended, it would not go to decision. Everyone was curious if Hagler's legendary chin could stand up to Hearns' legendary right hand. And with Hagler throwing brutal but reckless punches, it didn't take long to get an answer. Fighting with his back against the ropes, Hearns caught Hagler with a few decent right hands, punctuated by a powerful uppercut. Hagler's legs wobbled, and he was forced to step back and cover up. Hearns was in fast pursuit, and Hagler just managed to duck under his lead hook and clinch, pushing Hearns back to the ropes and buying valuable time to recover. Hagler had expected this. He had figured he would be caught eventually, but he had noted before the fight that although he'd been shaken, he had never been hurt, while Hearns had been stopped. The way he figured it, he knew Hearns could go down, but Hearns didn't know for sure if Hagler could go down. Hagler managed to recover quickly, now confident that he could take Hearns' best shots. Only time would tell if he were right. The two men stood in the center of the ring and exchanged punches, each showing an exceptional ability to mix effective defense with powerful offense. Hagler led with his left, clipping Hearns. Hearns countered with an uppercut, but Hagler had retracted his cross in time and took it on his guard. It's hard to see at first because of the ref, but Hearns threw a cross off of his uppercut as he stepped backwards. Hearns could fight well in any direction, remaining balanced and able to load knockout power into his punches, but Hagler slipped his cross by stepping offline into an orthodox stance. Hearns was now a wide open target, and Hagler took advantage by throwing a lead hook at his head. But Hearns was already ducking off of his cross, maintaining defensive responsibility, and loading up to throw a lead hook of his own. Now it was Hagler's turn to duck under, but he had been overeager and was left off balance. Hearns saw an opportunity, and now he advanced on Hagler. But once again, Hagler's ability to effortlessly shift stances saved him, and stepping back into southpaw gave him the space he needed to slip inside. Hagler landed a right to the body, but Hearns crowded him, preventing him from throwing more effective punches. He then backed Hagler off with the lead hook as he pivoted to a safer angle. This high-level exchange had taken no more than 3 seconds, and it's crazy to think about that if either man had slipped up, even for a moment, it may have meant the end of the fight. Undeterred, Hagler pressed forward again. At first, both men remained unable to penetrate the other's defense. But then, punches began to find their mark. Hearns had a movement-based defense, so Hagler knew that if he could just get him against the ropes, it would be neutralized. Hearns was able to consistently punish Hagler as he moved backwards, but Hagler's head movement, shifting footwork, and gazelle punch allowed him to consistently drive Hearns towards the corners. And, in the last minute of the round, Hagler finally trapped Hearns in the corner, resulting in an intense close-range exchange. Both men boxed masterfully, framing to create space, weaving to avoid punches, and coming up with their own. Although Hearns landed some great shots that would have badly hurt most other opponents, Hagler began to get the better of the exchanges, timing Hearns' head movement to catch him as he came up, and throwing head-body combinations with tight, compact punches. At close range, the height difference actually worked against Hearns, leaving his body more exposed. But eventually, Hearns hit Hagler with 2 hard rights on his guard. He had fought his way off the ropes, but then Hagler stepped forward into a hard right, staggering Hearns and sending him crashing back against the ropes. Hagler pressed forward, but Hearns again fought his way off the ropes. And then, the round ended. The crowd cheered. This one round of boxing had seen more action than many entire fights. During one of the exchanges, Hearns had at some point landed a blow that opened a deep cut on Hagler's forehead, and blood would flow freely from it for the duration of the fight. As such, the attention was on Hagler's corner trying to stop the bleeding. But, unbeknownst to them, it was in Hearns' corner that a bigger problem was being dealt with. Hearns had broken his hand in a fight years ago, and as he returned to his corner, he was certain that it had happened again. But the idea of quitting never entered Hearns' mind, and he returned to the center of the ring to face his competitor without a second's hesitation. Perhaps due to his broken right hand, Hearns had decided to dance and maintain distance this round. But astonishingly, he seemed to still be looking to hurt Hagler with his right. He had just decided to pick his shots more carefully. Each time he landed must have caused incredible pain. What's truly impressive about this round is how well Hearns managed to maintain distance and set up shots, even missing his most powerful weapon. He would stop short as he stepped back, sneaking his rear hand forward and breaking his own rhythm to drive his punch into Hagler as he chased him. Hearns would then use this squared-up neutral stance for lateral movement, rebounding from one foot to another to exit out at an angle. Hearns remained elusive throughout the round, using head control to steer away from the ropes and circling with cross steps. But in the last minute of the round, Hearns grew careless and decided to throw a combination at mid-range. Hearns connected with a solid uppercut, and then slipped Hagler's countercross. Both men missed with the lead hook, Hagler stepping back into orthodox to throw with his left. But then, Hagler hit Hearns hard with the right cross, stepping out of it into southpaw to slip a hook to the outside, and then landing with an off-angle hook of his own. He now chased Hearns to the ropes, landing vicious combinations until the end of the round. And although Hearns had just been brutalized on the inside, he walked back to his corner with a smile. In Hagler's corner, the cut from the first round had gotten worse. Hagler had been subject to unfair judging in the past, and he deeply feared the fight would be stopped due to the cut. The bell rang, and both men met in the middle, for what was fated to be the last round of the fight. Both men were holding their own. Half a minute in, the referee halted the action. The blood was pouring so profusely that the ref was considering stopping the fight. After consulting with Hagler, the doctor decided to let it continue, at least for now. Hagler decided he needed to stop the fight before it was taken out of his hands, and the fight was stopped for him. Halfway through the third, Hagler saw his opportunity. Hearns was having great success using Muhammad Ali's circling pattern. But then, Hagler cut him off by stepping out into orthodox from southpaw and connected with an overhand right. Hearns was shaken badly, and Hagler ran after him, catching Hearns again just as he began to turn. Hearns yet again tried to escape, and Hagler's lead left hook swung wide. But then, Hagler shuffled into his cross with everything he had, connecting solidly and sending Hearns crashing to the floor. Hearns fought his way back up, but he was clearly still shaken, and the ref called the fight. It was a dramatic finish to one of the most explosive fights in boxing history, and one of my own personal favorites. Both men could box well, and both men had taken their time in prior fights. They each knew they were fighting the absolute best, and they put everything they had into this short, brutal fight. It was an accumulation of years of hard work, practicing their craft, and working their way to the pinnacle of the sport, all showcased in under 3 rounds of beautiful, savage ringcraft. And although only one man won, the fight helped to immortalize both of them as two of the greatest boxers of their generation. After the fight was over, Hearns told his team to say nothing about his broken hand, saying he didn't want to take anything away from Hagler. The build-up to the fight had grown an intense rivalry between the two men, but each had earned the other's respect. The harsh words were forgotten, and Hearns visited Hagler's dressing room after he'd regained his footing. The two embraced and talked about the incredible experience they had both just endured. And Hagler began to look forward to the future, to the one great opponent of the era he had yet to conquer. Stay tuned for more fight breakdowns from the 4 kings of boxing, as well as more fight and technique breakdowns from the golden age of heavyweights.